Pam Bondi thought she was walking into a routine oversight hearing, until Letitia James turned the entire room against her with one opening sentence. "This isn't about ethics. This is about fraud dressed as law." The moment she said it, the air in the DOJ's internal review chamber cracked, not with noise, but with pressure. Every staffer, every aide, every journalist holding a pen knew instinctively that this wasn't a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. Bondi, seated beneath the seal of the Justice Department, blinked just once, then reset her posture like she had trained for this. But she hadn't. No one had. This wasn't campaign season theater or Sunday morning sparring. This was a surgical dissection of power, its abuse, its denial, and the institutions built to protect it. On paper, the hearing was supposed to examine procedural discretion and legal resource allocation. Off paper, it had one target: Pam Bondi's quiet manipulation of a $10 million legal protection fund, originally created to shield public servants from politically motivated lawsuits, but redirected line by line to cover her own escalating legal exposure for acts committed before she even held public office. And sitting across from her, arms folded and jaw set, was Letitia James, New York's Attorney General, relentless and composed, a prosecutor who didn't bring sound bites but affidavits. Bondi, to her credit, didn't flinch. She wore navy, like always, her tone balanced, her eyes trained not on the attack but the escape route. She'd done this before. Appeal to procedural nuance, cite precedent, invoke the dignity of public service. But the silence in room 241 wasn't waiting for nuance. It was waiting for someone to say out loud what everyone already knew, that Bondi had crossed a line and was now using the law to cover the tracks. This wasn't her first appearance before a panel, but the terrain had changed. Her old tactics, strategic deflection, charm laced with legalese, wouldn't work here. Not today. Not against Letitia James. And while the cameras were still adjusting focus, the room already had. Pam Bondi wasn't defending the law anymore. She was defending herself. There had been chatter, escalating, relentless, about impropriety, about undisclosed favors and friends disguised as clients, and suddenly the room was less a hearing than a public autopsy. The usual suspects on the committee took their swings. Some offered fluff disguised as fairness. Others performed neutrality like it was a Broadway role. Pam Bondi sat unbothered, draped in procedural smugness, until the shift came. Quiet, sharp. A pause. A name. Not just read, but dropped like a verdict. Attorney General Letitia James. She didn't clear her throat or adjust for effect. She simply leaned in, tone cold, deliberate. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman." And for the first time all morning, Bondi blinked. Most in the room barely looked up. Just another headline name, they thought. Some state prosecutor turned congresswoman with a flair for press quotes and courtroom dramatics. They'd heard of Letitia James, sure. Sharp tongue, unfiltered floor speeches, something about suing billionaires and getting under cable news skin. But this wasn't MSNBC, and Pam Bondi wasn't some hedge fund donor. This was face to face, and James was now seated directly across from the woman who had turned public office into a velvet-lined bunker. Bondi offered the smile, tight, knowing, the kind used by people who think they're still in control. James didn't blink. "Ms. Bondi," she began, "you've stated repeatedly that your office holds itself to the highest ethical standards, even in the absence of enforceable oversight. Is that correct?" Bondi clasped her hands, voice polished like a closing argument at a donor luncheon. "That's correct, Congresswoman. My office follows long-standing standards of ethical accountability." James nodded once, flipping a page like a blackjack dealer laying down her ace. "Then perhaps you can explain," she said, "why there was no disclosure of your financial ties to Westbridge Legal Passy, whose litigation landed on your desk last fiscal year." That broke the room. A camera snapped. Bondi didn't smile, just reached up and adjusted her necklace, tighter than usual. "I'm not at liberty to discuss active ethics reviews or details involving individual cases," Bondi said, her tone dipped in plausible deniability. "Right," James replied, glancing down at her folder, then back up with surgical calm. "But you can speak on precedent, correct?" "Yes." "Good," James continued, "because as I understand it, and do correct me if I'm mistaken, the Justice Department has long relied on the appearance of impropriety as a threshold, not just actual misconduct, but whether the public has reason to suspect it." Bondi shifted slightly. "That appearance standard has guided many offices, yes." James didn't pause. "Then wouldn't failing to disclose a close financial connection to someone who stood to benefit from your office's decision look ethically compromised?" She didn't shout. She didn't posture. She didn't have to. The room had gone still. Bondi remained poised, but the tempo had changed. "Congresswoman," she said slowly, "I believe we're venturing into hypotheticals." "I'm not," James replied, deadpan. "I'm quoting from your own agency's financial disclosures." And still, the room hadn't reached its boiling point. That was coming. Bondi straightened in her chair, one hand resting lightly on the polished table, eyes sharp, rehearsed. She scanned James's face for a tell, but James didn't blink. Her gaze was locked, her voice flat. "I'm quoting directly from your agency's disclosure reports, Ms. Bondi," she repeated, slower now, an open invitation for rebuttal. Bondi cleared her throat. "Those are compiled by the administrative staff. I trust the process is handled with diligence." "But do you review them?" James asked, head tilted slightly. "Do you personally verify what gets submitted is accurate and honest?" A short pause. "There is a system," Bondi replied. "Each official is responsible for their own disclosures." James leaned back. No smirk, no theatrics, just silence weaponized. "Interesting," she said. "Because where I come from, if you're grading your own paper, you're not being transparent. You're just hoping no one reads the footnotes." A few staffers glanced at each other. One let out the kind of breath that lives somewhere between laughter and disbelief. Bondi tried to reroute. "With respect, Congresswoman, the Attorney General's office is designed to operate independently from legislative interference. Our duty is to enforce the law, not bend to political narratives." James didn't flinch. "No one's trying to dictate your rulings. We're trying to understand why the same red flags keep showing up. Unanswered, unexplained." Bondi inhaled to speak, but James calmly raised a hand. "I've spent years in courtrooms," she said, "watching judges, black, brown, white, lecture young men on integrity, how even the appearance of dishonesty could ruin their lives. So, forgive me if I don't buy that you, sitting atop this institution, get to skip that standard." Bondi shifted. "Congresswoman, we take these matters seriously and conduct internal reviews with integrity." "You have no binding code," James cut in, cold. "And the only review comes from inside your own shop." A pause. "That's like asking a fox to write security policy for the hen house." A low murmur rippled through the back of the room. Cameras clicked more urgently. Reporters leaned in. James wasn't performing. She was cornering her target. Bondi inhaled through her nose, her fingers curling against the table's edge, still composed, but her voice now carried the tightness of someone who had just realized she was skating on thinner ice than she thought. The DOJ is not immune to scrutiny, she offered, but I'd remind the Congresswoman that mutual respect between co-equal institutions remains foundational. James looked down, then back up. A flash of annoyance, not because she was off track, but because she recognized the word respect for what it was, a diversion tactic. I respect your office, she replied. I respect what it's supposed to stand for, but respect without truth is set dressing. And the voters who sent me here, they didn't elect me to admire your oath. They sent me to ask why the rules shift depending on who signs the checks. Bondi met her gaze longer this time. Something shifted. She wasn't staring down a grandstander. She was facing someone who came to dismantle every excuse. And the next hit wouldn't be metaphorical. The next batch of documents in Letitia James's folder didn't look like much. Thin, barely a few stapled pages. But they carried weight. Not the kind that thuds on wood, but the kind that silences rooms. She slid one across the desk toward Bondi and adjusted her mic. Ms. Bondi, are you familiar with the case of Dalton versus Mason County, 5th Circuit, 2009? Bondi narrowed her eyes, not from confusion, but calculation. Vaguely, a procedural matter about recusal, if I recall. You do, James said. It involved a judge who failed to recuse despite indirect financial ties to a litigant. The court ruled that appearance alone was enough to disqualify him. She tapped the page. And yet, just last year, you involved yourself in Macon versus Delta Rail, where your longtime associate and campaign donor stood to gain from the ruling. Bondi didn't respond. James leaned forward. No recusal, no explanation, no transparency. And the outcome came down 5-4. This wasn't a headline soundbite. It was a scalpel aimed directly at the soft underbelly of institutional defense. Bondi exhaled, measured, tense. Congresswoman, I'm not here to re-argue individual cases. I'm not asking you to, James replied. I'm asking how an office built on the principle of fairness expects the public to trust it, when your rulings read more like private negotiations than justice. A few gasps, not loud, but sharp. A staffer's pen hit the floor. Bondi leaned in. Your language is inflammatory. James didn't flinch. And your silence, she said, has been worse. She let each word settle like an indictment. There's a woman in my district, Carla Jennings, single mother, worked overnight shifts for 20 years. Her son was denied financial aid because a typo made it look like she owed back taxes. She appealed, got denied. The court said, tough luck. James stared at Bondi. But a billionaire with ties to your office gets a hearing, a ruling, and a favorable outcome inside 4 months. Bondi's jaw tightened. We have limited resources. We must prioritize. James nodded. But perception matters, doesn't it? Bondi didn't respond, so James asked again, slowly this time. Ms. Bondi, does perception matter? Bondi gave a short nod. Of course. James dropped her voice half a tone. Then I suggest you start caring a bit more about what the public is seeing. Because right now they're not seeing justice. They're seeing power barricading itself behind credentials. For the first time, Bondi had no scripted comeback. The room froze. Even the committee chair didn't breathe. It was no longer oversight. It was something closer to history. James didn't raise her voice. She flipped another page. I came here with respect, she said, but I also brought facts. And the facts say your office has a problem, a deep one, and someone needs to stop pretending otherwise. The shift in Bondi's posture was subtle but unmistakable. She leaned forward, hands clasped, like she thought control could be reclaimed through body language. Her voice changed, less sure, more rehearsed. Congresswoman, while I understand your passion, I caution against drawing conclusions from isolated data points without full procedural context. James didn't blink. With all due respect, Ms. Bondi, I'm not drawing conclusions. I'm drawing connections, and there's a difference. She felt it, the pivot point, the moment the focus moved off Bondi's title and onto James's intent. In 2013, James continued, holding up another sheet, you gave a commencement speech at FSU Law. You told graduates, quote, credibility is your currency. Lose it, and everything collapses. Bondi leaned back. That's correct. James didn't wait. Then explain to me how credibility survives when public trust in your office is at its lowest point in decades, when more Americans believe your decisions follow campaign donations, not constitutional merit. Bondi hesitated. James pushed. You don't get to spend 20 years building a brand and then act surprised when the silence around your inner circle starts cracking open. Bondi opened her mouth. James cut her off. You call this passion. It's not. It's precision. I'm not yelling. I'm not speculating. I'm asking why Americans like Carla Jennings are held to standards your allies openly ignore. Her voice dropped again, sharper, firmer, final. Do you know what it feels like to enter a courtroom knowing the scales are tipped before you say a word? James asked, steady. I do. I've seen young men break down after sentencing, not because they were guilty, but because they never had a shot, because justice wasn't about truth. It was about access, about donors, about time. The room thickened. No typing, no whispers, just her voice cutting clean. Bondi tried to regroup. We've made efforts. Not enough, James snapped. Not when billionaires fly you to private resorts and no one blinks. Not when rulings come from behind doors no one can knock on. Then she said it. You're right about one thing. Credibility is currency. And right now, your institution is an overdraft. That line landed harder than anything James had said all morning. A law clerk near the back scribbled it down so fast the pen nearly tore the page. For the first time, Bondi, always armed with a rebuttal, had nothing. She just sat there. James let the silence stretch into discomfort, then leaned back slowly, letting the weight of her words settle like judgment. She wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't seeking applause. She was doing what no one else had dared, naming what the office had become: insulated, selective, untouchable. Bondi adjusted her blazer, but the motion felt more like a reflex than composure. The committee chair cleared his throat, ready to move on, then stopped, uncertain how to follow what had just unfolded. But James wasn't finished. Not until the American people are truly in this conversation, too. James wasn't here to spar with another polished bureaucrat in pearls. She came for something bigger, something that mattered to the people watching from living rooms, not law libraries. People who couldn't name court cases but lived with the fallout. She drew a breath and shifted tone. Less prosecutorial, more personal. There's a man in Odessa, she said. Jorge Salgado, drives trucks, never missed a shift during the pandemic, but when his brother was denied medical care in a private immigration facility, he filed a petition. And your office shut it down. No hearing? No explanation, just silence. James glanced at Bondi. He asked me why. I told him, because the law was written that way. Because the system's language was engineered to protect power, not challenge it. She leaned in. You had a chance to fix that. You refused. No statement, no vote, no courage. Bondi said nothing. James didn't stop. These aren't hypotheticals. These are people who believe in the law even when the law forgets them. People who think if they work hard, follow rules, someone will care. But what happens when they stop believing? When justice only shows up for those who can afford its attention? Her voice wasn't angry. It was raw, unpolished truth. I became a lawyer because I believed in fairness. I stayed because I learned fairness depends entirely on who's holding the pen. And right now, I'm staring at someone with more power than most Americans will ever touch, and she still pretends that power needs no restraint. Bondi finally replied, but the strength had faded. Congresswoman, I acknowledge these cases are difficult, but it's not the department's role to rescue. It's to enforce law as written. James nodded, eyes sharp. And what happens when the law is written to serve the few, when it's interpreted to shield the powerful? She didn't wait for an answer, because she already knew she wouldn't get one. You call it independence, but independence without accountability isn't strength, it's isolation. Someone in the back whispered, "She's right." Not loud, not performative, just honest. James turned over one last page. This isn't about politics. It's about principle. It's about telling people like Jorge and Carla that their stories don't expire the moment they walk out of your courtroom. She looked across the room. Because if this office won't hold itself accountable, then the people, through us, will ask the questions you won't. The camera caught her face first, then panned to Bondi. Mouth flat, no smile, no defense, no performance. Just silence. James looked at her one last time. I didn't come here to humiliate you, she said evenly. I came to remind you, justice isn't about title or tradition. It's about people who still believe someone in power might actually give a damn. But James hadn't walked through fire just to make a speech. She had one last line, and it was designed to stay. For several long seconds, no one moved. Silence didn't ask permission. It simply arrived. Reporters stopped typing. Staffers quit rustling pages just to look busy. Even committee members who had barely acknowledged the hearing now sat forward, eyes locked on James. Something had shifted. Bondi felt it too. Her posture held, but the armor had thinned. The tricks, calm tone, legal phrasing, polite deflection, had failed. James slowly closed her folder, hands folded on the table, voice low and reflective. Back home in Brooklyn, there was a judge, retired Marine, white guy. Didn't smile much, but he used to say, a courtroom is only as honest as the people brave enough to challenge it. She glanced at Bondi. I think about that a lot lately. There was no applause, no drama, just the weight of words settling where no one dared interrupt. Bondi shifted in her chair but offered nothing. Her confidence hadn't collapsed. It had simply been confronted. Across the room, Representative Leonard Franks, rarely heard from and never melodramatic, leaned into his mic and muttered, "Damn." It wasn't debate. It wasn't rhetoric. It was respect. James didn't even react. She wasn't there for validation. Chairman Bledsoe finally spoke, slower than usual. The committee thanks Attorney General James for her questioning. Even he hesitated, like moving forward might break whatever had just happened. Bondi reached for her water. Her hand trembled, not enough for most to notice. But James saw it. She looked Bondi in the eye. "You don't have to agree with me, Ms. Bondi, but you do have to hear me. That's all I came for." There was no malice in James's voice, no triumph, just something far harder to ignore. Truth, delivered without apology. One by one, other committee members resumed their questioning, but the energy had shifted. The tone was less performative now, more precise. No one wanted to follow her, but they had to, and none of them wanted to look like they were trying to sweep up after what she'd just detonated. Even Bondi spoke differently. Shorter sentences, less theory, more edge. Her charm retreated, her awareness heightened. Outside the building, the hearing had already spilled into the bloodstream of the internet. Clips of James's exchange were spreading like a signal flare. People who couldn't name a statute now watched a full congressional hearing between bites of lunch. In a Capitol Hill coffee shop, a barista stopped mid-order to replay a quote. In a Dallas classroom, a black girl raised her hand and asked her teacher, "Is she a lawyer?" And in living rooms across the country, Americans who had stopped trusting the system felt something they hadn't in years. Representation that didn't flinch. Inside room 241, Bondi glanced at James, this time without the air of superiority. It wasn't defeat. It was recognition. She wasn't the future. She was the now. And as the room began to normalize again, there was one thing left unsaid. Because this wasn't just about oversight or optics. It was about legacy. The room had returned to its routine rhythm, at least on the surface, but anyone paying attention could feel it. Something had cracked. What began as a tightly scripted DOJ oversight hearing had now been branded, burned, really, by a moment no one could redact, spin, or ignore. Letitia James wasn't speaking anymore, but she didn't need to. Her presence lingered like the smell of gunpowder after a clean shot. She hadn't just confronted Pam Bondi. She'd forced the entire machine to blink. As the next representatives took their turns, James sat in silence. No smirks, no asides, just stillness. She knew what had happened. She didn't need to say it again. About 30 minutes later, Chairman Bledsoe announced a recess. Members stretched, staffers stood, journalists bolted for Wi-Fi. Bondi rose from her seat, paused, then glanced back. James didn't move. "Attorney General," Bondi said quietly, voice thinner now. "Your district is lucky to have you." James looked up. "I know." No posturing, no smile, just clarity. Bondi nodded, less official, more human, and walked out. She didn't look shaken, just quieter. As the room emptied, a young woman in the gallery, law student Missouri, blazer 2 sizes too big, walked up, nervous. "I just wanted to say," she began, "I didn't think anyone ever spoke to them like that." "Not really." James stood, adjusted her sleeves. "Spoke to them like what?" The student blinked. "Like they're not above you." James smiled. "Not big, not performative. Just enough." "They're not." That was it. She picked up her folder and left without another word. That night, the moment hit prime time. Not just political panels, but nightly news. It wasn't the clash that grabbed people. It was how calm it was. How surgical. Like James hadn't just won. She'd taught a master class. Pundits tried to reframe it. Some said it was a swipe at the establishment. Others called it showboating. But those who watched, who listened, heard something different. Clarity. For decades, Americans were told these institutions were sacred, untouchable. But James had just shown, lawfully, unshakably, that even sacred things need to be questioned. That unchecked power doesn't protect order, it corrodes it. And maybe, just maybe, the tension in that hearing wasn't disruption. It was accountability, arriving right on time. Because real change doesn't always march in waving signs. Sometimes it sits across the table, fearless. If Letitia James could speak truth to power, then maybe, just maybe, so can we.